Welcome to Block 7 of our Celebrating the States Block of the Month, the Connecticut block. For this block, I used 4 different background fabrics, 2 reds and 2 blues. This block is so versatile, and I love making scrappy quilts, so stay to the end of the video to see how I'm using this block to use up scraps. Cut 2 squares 4 inch by 4 inch from 4 different background fabrics for a total of 8 squares. If you prefer, you could just use 1 background instead of 4. You just need to have a total of 8 squares that measure 4 inches by 4 inches. From 2 different blues and 2 different reds, cut 2 squares 4 inches by 4 inches from each fabric. To simplify, you could just use 1 red and 1 blue, or just 1 single fabric. All you need to make sure you have is 8 squares that measure 4 inches by 4 inches. I'm cutting through 4 layers here, but if you're not comfortable cutting through that many layers, you can just do 1 fabric at a time. You should have a total of 8 squares that have red and blue and 8 background squares. On the wrong side of each of the background squares, you need to draw a line from corner to corner. If you prefer not to draw the lines, you can use a product like the diagonal seam tape to help you sew a 1/4 inch away from the center line on both sides. With right sides together, layer your squares a background with a red or a blue and sew a 1/4 inch away from that center line on both sides. These can easily be chain stitched through the machine. Just keep feeding them through. I usually will work in either pairs or just send all of them through, cut them apart, and then flip them around and do the other side. Make sure you hit that like button to let us know you found the block, and subscribe so that you won't miss any of the blocks in our Celebrating the States series. Once you have all the seams sewn, head over to your cutting mat and cut the triangles apart. I like to use my ruler for this because then I know my lines will be straight and I won't make my seam allowance too narrow. After you're done cutting, head to the ironing board to press. All the squares that have the blue fabric, you will press those towards the background fabric. All the squares that have the red fabric, you will press towards the red fabric. Pressing in this manner will help you nest your seams together later when you're making the block. Once these squares are pressed, it's time to trim them all down to 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. I love using my block lock ruler. It has a channel built into it for the seam, so it makes squaring up and trimming these easy. Separate the squares into 4 sets of 4 matching half square triangle units. All of the diagram triangles should point the same way. Piece the squares together using 1/4 inch seam allowances. All the sets should look similar as you send them through the machine. I press these in sets of 2 so that I can make sure when I sew them together that one seam will go one direction and the other seam will go the other direction so they will nest. I'm also going to pin mine together so that I don't accidentally flip it around and sew it together wrong. Piece these together using your 1/4 inch seam allowance and you will have the 4 corners of the block done. Press these units. They should all measure 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches. Once they're pressed, take them back to the sewing machine and arrange them into the block. Then you will make 2 half blocks. Most of these seams, when you're sewing, should nest together because of the way that you press the blocks. Press both of these half blocks towards one side, either the red or the blue. Then when you flip the one side over to sew the 2 sides together, you'll have your seams going in opposite directions. One last seam and our Connecticut block is done. While sewing this block, my mind would wander to my little drawer full of 3.5 inch half square triangle blocks. I thought this block, the Connecticut block, would be a great way to use those squares up. The squares in the drawer are leftovers from projects or were used in a demo for a technique or a tool. One last trip to the ironing board to press and this block is finished. Now that my block is done, I think I'm going to play around with my scrap pile and see what I can make. The first step is to divide the piles into sets of 4 squares that can be sewn together. A lot of them matched, many of them didn't, some are totally random. The next step is to sew those 4 squares together to make a corner of the block. Now, if the squares are all the same, it's easy to lay it out and know how to put it together. But if they don't match, I would just usually lay it out until I found a look that I liked. And then you just need to sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I just keep chain stitching them right through the machine. Now, once that starts getting to be a little bit long, I bring it around to the front so that I can see the end or the starting point. And then I just cut them off in sets of 2 that are connected. You want to keep them connected because then they're in the proper position to just flip the one over on the other and sew it together into a set of 4. When it comes off the other end, you will have your set of 4 blocks sewn together. With just a little bit of organization, you can sew for hours like this. And I just save them all up and then take them all over to the ironing board at once, so I'm not constantly getting up and down to iron. The fun part about sewing some of these pieces together was remembering what they were for the original project I'd used them in. When I was sewing these, I did not press when I had 2 sewn together. I waited until I had the whole corner sewn, the 4 of them sewn together, so that I could just press once. Once I figured this trick out about cutting them off the back end in sets of 2 and then just flipping the one on top of the other to sew it together so that I didn't have to rearrange my pieces or try to figure out the way it was supposed to go, it made the whole process a whole lot faster. I was able to use up all my half square triangle units that measured 3.5 to make 124 different corners. Each block needs 4 corners, so that means I will end up with 31 blocks. So I set it 5 by 6, which is 30 blocks, so I'll have an extra one that I can leave out. Here I have 4 corners that are in the same color family, and they each have the same background actually too. So I just rearranged them a couple different ways to try to figure out how I wanted to set this block. You can turn these corners every which way to make a whole bunch of different kinds of blocks. This is what the block looks like if you have just 2 fabrics, a dark and a light. And again, you can set these blocks different ways. It was really fun to turn them and see how it looked. I just kept rearranging it and seeing how many different ways I could make the blocks. In the end, I decided to stick with the original layout. I like that one the best, and it really suited the fabrics. And then it was time to lay it out and see how they would look. I was going to just kind of do it random all over the place, but then I decided what I wanted to do was to keep some like ones together to kind of look like blocks, and then make some that were similar, and then all the random ones would be left at the end, and then those would just be kind of fun random blocks. At first I was going to stick with the rectangular shape, but then I discovered if I set it on point, I could use all 31 of the blocks that I made. I tried out a few different fabrics to use for my setting triangles. I tried a light, I tried a blue, but the fabric I decided to go with is a black background that has multicolored building shapes in the background. It is a directional print, so I'll have to be a little bit careful about cutting out my triangles, but I think it should look really cool when it's finished. Having an empty drawer where all these scraps used to be is pretty satisfying. And here are all 31 of my blocks. I don't have the quilt completely finished yet, but I will soon, and I will share the quilt with you when I get it done. We hope you remembered to hit that like button and make a comment about our project. Share with your quilting friends, and most importantly, subscribe so that you won't miss any of the blocks in our Celebrating the States series. Look in the description below for a link to the Celebrating the States playlist. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!